Let's go, gang. Let's be working out here. No penalties in that center ice zone. No extra holds out there.
It was a team of rebels in an outlaw league. The Minnesota Fighting Saints were charter members of the World Hockey Association, an organization that began play in 1972 as an in-your-face challenge to the pro hockey establishment. Based in downtown St. Paul, the Saints were a unique collection of characters, colorful and sometimes cartoonish, with a blend of talent and toughness that became an entertaining alternative to the crosstown Minnesota North Stars.
Their team was really bad. It was slow, and it was not very good at that time. So they had a terrible time in the NHL. Well, the Saints were rollicking, freewheeling, totally entertaining. They might win, they might lose, and you might not care.
For parts of 5 seasons, the Fighting Saints were the capital city's professional hockey team, the pride of St. Paul, and they won more than they lost. But their story isn't just a tale of victories and defeats. It's a real-life saga of sweat and blood, of camaraderie and red ink, and a sporting chapter that can't be forgotten.
It's just mayhem out in the ice.
If everybody, I think, that has anything to do with hockey or likes hockey has seen the Slapshot movie, well, we've lived that.
October 1972 will go down in the annals of sports history as the year when a modern-day miracle occurred. 12 brand-new, fully manned, well-balanced Canadian and American hockey teams took to the ice and began thawing out the first ice age.
This was a big deal because, you know, you'd had the ABA, and it had, you know, it had survived and got absorbed somewhat by the NBA, and you'd had the AFL, you know, kind of outlaw leagues, and they'd been successful.
A creation of Gary Davidson and Dennis Murphy, the men who had founded the American Basketball Association, the WHA awarded a franchise to a group of St. Paul investors in 1971. Hired from the University of Minnesota, Glenn Sonmore became the Fighting Saints coach and general manager. Sonmore remembers the league's first draft and comments from a Canadian owner, Wild Bill Hunter.
He got up, I'll never forget it as long as I live, and looked out at that vast, they had hundreds of reporters and TV, and Bill Hunter looked out there and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the greatest day in the history of the world."
The upstart league found uncharted markets for a number of its franchises, but it went head-to-head with the NHL in places like New York, Chicago, Boston, and the Twin Cities.
I think there's always a tendency to view these challengers and all these pro leagues somewhat lightly, my gut feeling was that they didn't take them that seriously.
Those of us who were on the North Stars had the opportunity, I have to say, the good fortune of getting our contracts renewed and salaries escalated dramatically, almost double immediately.
The impetus for increased salaries and instant credibility for the WHA came with $1 million price tag. It was a league-paid bonus to Bobby Hull, who signed with Winnipeg.
Well, the big deal was, of course, with Bobby Hull signing that big contract, which he did in St. Paul. In fact, he did it in the Minnesota Club, right where the Minnesota Wild now hold forth.
Sonmore's approach was less expensive and more provincial. With a $750,000 budget, his original signees included former North Stars Wayne Connolly and Ted Hampson. His first draft choice, Warroad's Henry Boucher, went to Detroit of the NHL. But the Saints roster featured a fleet of Minnesotans, such as Billy Klatt, Lefty Curran, Mike Antonovich, and Jack McCartney.
It was an experience, there's no doubt about that. And you know what, the league was entertaining, you know, probably more entertaining than pure hockey, but the hockey was good too.
I had been drafted by the North Stars, but with Glenn in St. Paul, it was easy for me to take a look at St. Paul and go with him because he was giving me an opportunity to play.
The World Hockey Association has arrived.
The Saints opened their first season at the St. Paul Auditorium. In January of 1973, they moved into pro hockey's state-of-the-art facility, the brand-new St. Paul Civic Center.
Make sure we're on him now.
By season's end, Sonmore had turned the coaching reins over to Harry Neal. The team made the playoffs, and the Saints had just begun to fight.
When Glenn would look at a prospective player for his team, instead of looking at the goals and assists and points first, he'd always go to the penalty minutes.
This is the St. Paul Civic Center, one of the most beautiful buildings for hockey in all the world. Although it's empty right now, the hockey season is just around the corner, and in not too long a time, there'll be people here cheering the Minnesota Fighting Saints on in every game.
The Fighting Saints began their second season with a number of new faces. The critical acquisition was a goal scorer and a Stanley Cup winner in both Toronto and Boston.
I'd like you to meet Mike Walton, who I think is the most exciting offensive hockey player to ever play professional hockey in the state of Minnesota.
Going into the WHA, where they had these different characters, and they wanted showboats. They wanted, like, Thanos was supposed to be the Joe Namath of hockey, and so I fit in good there because I was, you know, a little crazy myself.
Walton was signed on the recommendation of Harry Neal.
You're all right at next shift there, Shake?
I guarantee you he'll get us 50 goals. Not only that, 20 of them will be the most spectacular goals you ever saw in your life, shorthanded and everything else. And he's just an electrifying player for the crowd, and that's exactly what he was.
One of the best skaters I've ever seen in my life, when he decided to skate, we're talking about rocket fuel. He could just fly.
Nicknamed Shaky, Walton was talented and eccentric.
He was a character, a very talented hockey player. But he was a character, I'll say that. You never knew what Shaky was going to do.
Shaky's problem, great team guy. Shaky's problem was that, you know, he used a lot of unleaded regular, too. And that unleaded regular fuel, you know, he'd go out there and float around a lot.
He would take the odd night off once in a while when he didn't feel like playing, and so Harry and I'd get together, and we finally had to convince him. How many coaches have sat down with their players like this, say, look, Mike, we know you're going to take a night off once in a while, but you can't do it here at home.
The MVP of the 1974 All-Star Game held in St. Paul, Walton was the league's leading scorer and a favorite for the growing numbers at the Civic Center.
People came to see Mike Walton, amongst a few others, but that's the guy they came to see. He was a star. He had the highest paycheck, and he drew the people, and he could score goals. He would hang out at the red line and didn't play defense, but you get him the puck, and he'd just sail in there and score.
I remember that year I won the scoring championship that I went a period of 13 games without a goal, and they were going crazy. I mean, they were booing me and everything. They, you know, wanted to lynch me. And then I scored 11 goals in 3 games, and the love affair was back on.
Walton is best remembered for his goal-scoring ability and behavior that was sometimes unusual.
Whatever the wildest thing that Randy Moss could think of doing wouldn't even make the book on Shaky Walton.
He got upset, and we lost, I think it was a playoff game, and we were heading to the dressing room. He took a right turn through the garage and put his skates on, and sparks were flying all the way to his car, jumped in his car, and took off.
Jumped in the car with my gloves and my skates, all my whole full uniform on, and drove out of the building downtown St. Paul, right into one of my favorite bars downtown. Went in there, double parked, went in the car, had about 4 or 5 double rum and cokes, and the people in there was packed, and they were screaming, yelling, going nuts, and signing autographs. Got in, downed all the drinks, went out of the building, right home, and pouted.
Walton was an offensive piece of a puzzle outlined by toughness.
Glenn was the architect of the team, so you know there's going to be some rough and tumble characters, and we had those.
3 of them came from Virginia, Minnesota. The brothers Carlson, Jack, Jeff, and Steve, were discovered at a tryout camp.
We did it more of a publicity stunt than anything. Let's have a big whole tryout, let everybody try out, and we'll get a lot of good publicity. We didn't expect to find any players at all. And here came these 3 kids with a big horn-rimmed glasses on, and we looked at them and said, oh my goodness.
The Carlsons wound up at the Saints Farm Club in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and became the inspiration for the hit movie Slapshot. Harry Neal was there the night they entered the stands in Utica, New York.
They played the next night, Johnstown did back in Johnstown, so I had to spend $175 to get him out of jail. So I phoned Sonmore and said, Glenn, I don't know whether these guys are good enough to play on our team, but I'll tell you one thing. If we bring them up, any one or all 3, we want to start them at home because they're going to have people coming back to see their next act.
I sat between 2 of them in the dressing room at one time in the corner. Well, they were pulling pranks all the time. It was just like Slapshot, you know. They had everything but the toy trains.
Jack Carlson was called up first, and his physical presence became legendary.
You know, you say, don't worry about fighting, nobody ever gets hurt. Well, if you fought with Carlson, you might get hurt because he had the great big knuckles and the great big hands, and he just would pummel you.
If you look at his hands, they look like a bunch of bananas. He had big hands and just a real big reach, and he could pull people in like they're on a fishing reel and then just send them back out like they're on a roller coaster and snap their heads, and he was real accurate.
Carlson delivered his share of knockouts, including one to Mike Walton when the Saints played Johnstown on a promotional stop in Mankato.
Shaky Walton goes in the corner with my younger brother Steve and drills him. I step in there and let Shaky have one right in the mug. And it was like turning on a faucet.
I skated as hard as I could before Jack was going to drop my gloves, and I woke up about a half hour later. He just broke my nose from one side to the other, dropped me.
I thought, my gosh, you know, this could be, here's the superstar player. And I walked up to him and I wanted to talk about, but how do you approach him? I said, gee, Shaky, do you suppose there could be any hard feelings from that? He said, God, I hope not.
Players fighting everywhere inside the Saint zone.
The fighting and the Fighting Saints was a real deal.
Players in sticks and gloves all over the ice.
Philadelphia Flyers were winning the Stanley Cup, and everybody was patterning themselves after the Flyers, the Broad Street Bullies.
It's just mayhem on the ice.
Got a photo of the two Cleveland goaltenders and Johnny Garrett and myself. We're all standing in the photo looking out into space. And what we're looking at is 20 guys in a pile down at that other end of the rink. And we're just staying away waiting for them to finish.
The Fighting Saints employed an assortment of tough guys, including the Carlsons, Bill Butters, Kurt Brackenberry, and Bill Goldthorpe.
I wrote that he was just as hard as cement with a head to match. He looked like a dandelion gone to seed. And a good friend of mine says, aren't you afraid that Goldthorpe will read that and beat you up, and you know, when he sees you next? And I said, I'm gambling that he can't read.
Officially, Goldthorpe played just 3 games for the Saints in the playoff series against Gordie Howe and the Houston Aeros in 1974.
He was just an absolute character, and he loved to taunt people all the time, and he's hollering at Howe, you know, who could have ripped his head off. Goldthorpe was absolutely fearless. And Howe did have his 2 boys playing. One was 17 and one was 18. And Gordie, as you can imagine, was very protective of them. Well, Goldthorpe saw that as his opening, I guess, and then he hollered over to Howe. Then finally he said, Gordie, says, you're not going to play forever, and when you quit, I'm kicking the crap out of your 2 kids.
Goldthorpe was in uniform when the series came to St. Paul before a record crowd at the Civic Center.
They had a few other players on that Houston team. Most specifically, I remember Johnny Shella, who was a defenseman. And he was a stick mechanic, old John was. I mean, Johnny would like to put the stick in your face and leave some slivers there if he could.
I took off down the side boards with the puck, and next thing I know, right around the penalty box, my nose was broken, bleeding. My nose was over here. I turned around, and it was John Shella was there, and I believed that was him that did it. And I went crazy, and I shouldn't have, but I started trying to get it with my stick and chasing him and this and that. And so I got a 10-minute misconduct, a game misconduct, and it was, basically thrown out of the game. So Goldie Goldthorpe went in to serve the penalty. So before he goes in the box, he's skating around, he says, Shaky, don't worry about it, I'll get him. So when the penalty clock was up for him to come back on the ice, my time was served, the penalty keeper says to him, Goldie, don't forget your stick and gloves. He says, I don't need them, I'll be back. And he went out onto the ice without his gloves and his stick, chased John Shella, who was his cousin, all around the rink. The people went crazy, and John was just skating as fast as he could, trying to hide behind guys and all that, because he knew how crazy Goldie was. And finally, he had found himself behind the net, and Goldie in front, and Goldie had a charge. He jumped over the net and grabbed him, and they had a big beef, beat the crap out of him. And that's what happened on that night. But it was a classic. He was an unbelievable character.
Goldthorpe's tenure in Minnesota was short-lived, unlike another tough customer, Gordie Gallant.
Gordie was a guy that came from the East Coast League, and he was a gunfighter. I mean, that's what he was. Gordie Gallant came in and just ran away with the hearts of the people in St. Paul. I've never seen a player with so much charisma come in and just win the hearts of everybody.
He was one of those guys that had a short fuse and could go on the ice, could go in the saloon, or could go in the locker room. We never knew.
As popular as he was with the public, Gallant forced his own exodus in April of 1975.
We were going to play the first game of the playoffs against the Hartford Whalers, and I had a curfew because I knew we had a very explosive team on the ice and off. So I said, be in by midnight, and I started calling the rooms. And Mike McMahon, our defenseman, roomed with Gordie Gallant, and he said, Gordie's not here. About an hour and a half later, Mike McMahon phones and says, Gordie came in and he's pissed off. and he's coming up to see you.
A lot of things happen, and that led up to a lot of things. And last night I was out 45 minutes late from curfew. I was late, and I was in the wrong. I went up to see Mr. Neal, and I exploded, you know.
Well, 10 seconds later, we hear the knock at the door, and I'm rooming with Jack McCartan, my assistant coach, and Jack's saying, "Don't answer the door." And it's Gordy yelling at me, and I said, "Come on, I mean, we've never had any trouble with Gordy Gallant before." So I open the door, and I'm in my underwear and no shirt, and I open the door, and whack, he suckers me.
I heard the door open, and I heard splat. There was Harry on his hands and knees bleeding, and there was Gallant in the doorway. So then him and I got into it.
And the next thing I know, I'm outside, Gordy's inside, and I hear Jack McCartan yelling, "Help, Harry!" And the furniture was going wild. Jack was fighting with him.
Gallant was gone the next morning.
I don't think you can build a franchise out of fear, and I don't think any one individual can put himself ahead of the coach or the team or the franchise, and therefore a decision had to be made.
Hours later, the Saints and the Whalers played to overtime in a game interrupted by a Donnybrook. The heavyweights were Jack Carlson and New England's enforcer, Nick Fotiu.
Before the game started, it was a big game. Nick came over to me and said, "Shake, if you touch the puck tonight, I'm going to kill you." Jack skates over to him, says, "You touch him, I kill you." I turned to Harry and said, "This is great hockey, isn't it?"
In the first period, the Saints were outplayed.
Bill Butters, a conspicuous absentee in period number 1.
Harry wasn't playing us, so Glenn came down and he had a little meeting with Kurt Brackenberry, myself, Jack Carlson, and Harry Neal in a little cubbyhole of a room. And Glenn said, "What do you think these guys are here for, Harry?"
They called Butters and myself and Kurt Brackenberry in and said, "Listen, we're going to start you guys and see if we can get this thing turned around. And if need be, if you need to get something going, do it."
Throwing some punches at Larry Plow.
So at the start of the second period, the puck drops. They don't worry about the puck. They drop their gloves and they start hammering.
Brackenberry gets 2 right hands. Selwood wrestling him now. 15 feet inside the line. Here's Butters, sneaks up, shot on Plow. Bill Butters from behind. That's all. Here comes the bench. We've got a wild goal here now.
And one of the things told to Bill was, you know, if anybody looks at you, Bill, sucker.
The despicable act by Bill Butters, sucker punching Larry Plow. We've got a wild goal here now. And now Nick and Carlson come together.
Well, I got paired up with their tough guy. His name is Nick Fotiu, who was the New York State boxing champion.
Here they go. Fotiu and Carlson.
You could hear the knuckles hitting their faces. It was unbelievable. And one each said to the other, "Are you finished? Had enough?" "Yes, yes." And when Nick dropped his gloves, dropped his hands, Jack suckered him. He went right down like a big timber.
Oh, Carlson just got Nick.
We went at it pretty good for about 10 or 15 minutes.
I've never seen a scene like this, Bill, ever. I've seen many a nasty brawl, but never one as vicious and as long as this one.
They boarded the same charter with us, returning to St. Paul, and we were already on the plane, and then the Hartford team came on after us.
Well, they're coming by, and we're looking at the guys, and now Nick comes in. And his face is pretty messed up. And Shake Walton says, "Looking good, Nicky." Well, I thought another brawl was going to start out in the plane, but we kind of won that series on that airplane. I think we won that series.
The Minnesota Fighting Saints were a colorful group on the ice and in the front office.
It was kind of like a president for a day, and at the end of this term that I was there, anybody that had any money could be president.
The man who had the position the longest was the St. Paul attorney, Wayne Belisle.
I'm a St. Paul guy through and through, and it was great to have something over here for a change. You know, everything had went over there. This had always been a good hockey town. It had always been a good boxing town, and yet the main sports all went to Minneapolis.
When the Saints' original investors couldn't make a go of it, Belisle stepped in. He had the interest, but not the pocketbook.
Well, if you remember in the old days, they had what they called checking plus. If you overdrew your checking account, they allowed you a certain... I had checking plus at Commercial State Bank up to $1,200. So that was about it.
When Belisle got the league to guarantee a payroll, he was given first option on the team. With his own investors, he watched the Saints play to some record crowds at the Civic Center and made a push to sign Bobby Orr. The Saints did acquire Paul Holmgren, Johnny McKenzie, and future Hall of Famer Dave Keon.
Instant credibility. I mean, he was the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Stanley Cup. I mean, and here I was playing with him. What an opportunity for him. For a kid from the Iron Range to play with somebody like that.
But the opportunity didn't last long. just prior to the 1975-76 season, Belisle's investors pulled out.
There was a lot of pressure, and I had a lot of sleepless nights because by that time that it happened, you know, particularly when my investors got out, I mean, I really lived and died this team as Glenn and Harry and the players did.
Well, the key to payday for the people in the office was that we knew when Mike Rowan was going to make out the checks, and the secret was to get to the bank before Mike Walton did, because Shaky was the highest paid player, and usually there was not enough money to get past a couple players, and then things started bouncing around.
Before long, the Saints couldn't make payroll.
We'd have team meetings, split up some money, demand to meet with first the coaching staff, the management, say what's going on, are we going to get paid next payroll or not?
Before a game, I mean, they had a big, like, fish bowl, huge in the lobby on both sides of the Civic Center, and people were throwing quarters and dimes and dollars and $5 bills and $10 bills, and their kids were coming up, you know, cracking their piggy bank open. I mean, it's funny, and looking back, it was sad.
I called up, and people had been laid off in the office. Glenn answered the phone. Minnesota Fighting Accordions. I said, Fighting Accordions? He said, yeah, so many rumors of us folding, I thought we'd change our name.
For several weeks, the players stayed together, competing without a paycheck.
There was no money to pay these guys, and they kept playing anyway. They played for about 6 weeks when they weren't being paid, and played really well.
During that month, we had the best one-loss record in the league. And we go to places like Calgary, and they'd say, well, how the heck are you guys doing it? You know, you're not paying the guys. Maybe we shouldn't pay our guys. There was a rumor at one time that the Teamsters Fund was going to bail the Saints out. And supposedly that was money from the Mafia. And that story wasn't true, but at least if we had that money, nobody was going to fool around with us.
The end finally came on February 28, 1976, at the Twin Cities Airport.
We had this trip to Cincinnati, and we didn't have the money, but Glenn said, be at the airport, I'll have the money, and we're going to go to Cincinnati.
We got $35,000. Glenn literally had a paper bag. I was driving the car. He was sitting at the right. He had a list of the per diems and who got what, and he was stuffing it in envelopes. We were figuring out what the salary was and what 1/40th was, and we were putting it in envelopes for him. We were going to give it to him in the airport and have him play these 2 games. Keon was gone, McKenzie was gone, Walton was gone. All, you know, so many of the people that were the heart of this team, and Holmgren was gone, and so they finally said, we just don't want to do it anymore. So, and I can understand that.
We had the money to go, but there's 3 or 4 more players. They had agents, had jobs for them with other teams, and they said they just weren't going to go. So we were down to 7 or 8 players that were willing to go, and you know, that wasn't enough. So we folded there in the airport here in Minneapolis.
The following season, the Fighting Saints were reborn when the Cleveland franchise moved to Minnesota. But like its predecessor, Saints too folded during the season, ending a wild and distinctive chapter of the WHA in St. Paul.
It was sad in a lot of ways because these guys, they loved it here. It was a great place to play. They had great support from the fans. The whole thing was a wonderful experience for all of us, I think. We learned a whole lot about ourselves and about life.